Today is Victory in Europe Day.
Just as I have a dream.
A salute from Mr. Nelson Mandela.
And Mrs. Thatcher.
The world has had their eyes pegged to the television since last night. The US, the so-called beacon of democracy and freedom around the world, has just suffered its very own diet coup attempt. Today I'm joined by my two brilliant co-hosts Samuel Moore and Rachel Duffy to unpack the events of yesterday and discuss a little bit more about the causes of them and what their implications are. Before we get into that, as always, great if you guys could subscribe, like, share our videos because it really helps us out and helps us grow. So I think the first thing when unpacking this whole situation is what were, these Congress men and women and Mike Pence doing at the Capitol building yesterday? So essentially what they're doing is they're confirming Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's presidency and vice presidency by kind of rallying up or counting up all the kind of electoral college votes, right? During this kind of process of confirmation, Trump supporters basically entered the Capitol building and took it under siege. I don't know if you guys have a better word to describe it, but that's essentially what it was. Some of them armed, and sadly, Congress had to be evacuated from this whole process and taken to a safe location. And eventually, these protests were pushed back. But when all things were done, 4 people passed away from this event. It just was a very surreal and crazy night. We'll definitely have images up on screen to be showing you kind of what went down, really. So one of the obvious short-term causes of this whole situation, I would say, is the Georgia Senate runoff races, which were happening in the U.S. So these are really important because, if you control the Senate, basically controlling the Senate gives you a lot of power. If you control the House, Senate, and presidency, then you can really try pass and push legislation which you want. And this has to do with essentially the different roles of the House of Representatives and the Senate. So I think that's probably a good place to start when discussing the kind of like what differences between them are is important to highlight before we kind of start to discuss the implications of all these protesting and riots and stuff like that. So the House of Representatives essentially make up legislation and try pass amendments and things to existing legislations and stuff like that. And the Senate has a lot of functions, but on a day-to-day basis, its primary function, I would say, is to essentially decide when things can be put up to vote for the Senate. And legislation obviously passes when you have a majority of the House of Representatives voting for legislation and, the Senate, of course, as well. So yeah, that's sort of the background of these what background in terms of how the legislative branch of government set up. So how about the Georgia runoff races? So first of all, it's important to also discuss, why there was a Georgia runoff race, because you would expect this to essentially have passed with the November elections. But during the November election, neither candidates who were going up for kind of the Senate races got a majority of over 50%. So that's essentially why they had to redo these elections and things like that. So yeah, I guess I'll bring in Samuel and Rachel to discuss their thoughts and things like that on the matter.
I'm sure we're gonna go into it a bit later, but yeah, just the scenes yesterday were just, as you said, it was just surreal, and just seeing the photos of, them first of all, the police just letting them into the Capitol building with hardly no resistance. Also just the security within the building, barricading doors, pointing guns at the insurgents. It's just it's just a crazy, surreal experience. And as we'll mention later, I think it's been a long time coming. And it's just I think we'll see it more often throughout Western liberal democracies. But this is just a summation of everything that's happened over decades. But going back to Georgia, I think, obviously, I think the Democrats win in both of the remaining seats. I think for Senate, I think it's very good. It's obviously great for them. Because obviously, yeah, as you said, they have the majority in this. Oh, they're actually 50-50 in the Senate, and Kamala Harris gets the final say. So I think, I mean, that'll generally favor Democrats. So yeah, so basically they have the Senate and House majority, and this should allow them to pass legislation in a more easier manner, um, in comparison to having Mitch McConnell blocking everything that comes his way. So yeah, I think it's great news, but also I think this is an opportunity, especially for the left to organize and start pushing for popular legislation that, especially around healthcare, for example, which has majority support, stuff around the environment, worker protection, unions, giving more power to unions, for example. And I think this is like this opportunity to seize this, and I mean, I think in one sense maybe Joe Biden preferred not to have the majority, because now this definitely pressurizes them to go through with some more left progressive legislation. Because I think oftentimes, especially with Obama, for example, like a lot of the excuses were that he never had a majority, But even if he did have a majority for the first 2 years, I mean, for the majority of his presidency, he didn't have a majority. So yeah, now, I mean, there's nowhere to hide, and yes, it's a good news for the Democrats. It should be good news for the Democrats, and hopefully, this is the time to pass some legislation that can really, help people. So I think it's positive news, and it's also always positive news that Republicans lose. So so that's good.
Yeah, I agree. I think it was obviously really interesting what was happening in Georgia, but especially interesting with what it then led to and the events that we did all see last night. It's crazy. And I think what's really important to focus on initially is the hypocrisy and the double standards of the Trump administration and the right wing. And Trump tweeted anarchists, agitators, or protesters who vandalise or damage federal courthouses will face a minimum of 10 years in prison. Other right-wing commentators, I'm sure we're all familiar with those kind of Tommy Lauren tweets of if Republicans were to lose, which they won't, they would carry on with their day-to-day lives. They would respect the result. They wouldn't be out on the streets protesting. And I think another quote from Trump, which really is hot on the lips of a lot of people today, is when the looting starts, the shooting starts, which marks just such a stark comparison to last night's message of go home, we love you, you're very special, I know how you feel. This really empathetic kind of message. It was the least that he could do to tell people to remain peaceful, to call off this rally that he has incited, as Samuel was saying, not just in the past 4 years, but has been kind of rumbling below the surface of America. So I think just the double standards and the comparisons that one can draw to the Black Lives Matter movements and protests over the summer period and the deaths, the arrests between the two, the amount of armed police and the presence of such in those protests was just absolutely colossal in comparison to what we saw last night. And I think that in itself really epitomises white privilege, how far those people could get in. And these are some very vicious people. They're not your everyday kind of Trump supporters. A lot of them had come in from other states, again through Trump inciting this to happen over a period of time, and other right-wing commentators, which I'm sure we'll get into. And they were sporting some very vicious kind of propaganda. We saw anti-Jewish sentiment, we saw references to the Holocaust and to Auschwitz, and we saw a lot of KKK kind of propaganda and things of these people. Again, it's also worth mentioning that very, very few were wearing masks in the middle of a pandemic. And it just, again, supports this narrative. And I think it really will be a stain, not only on Trump and his presidency, but on American democracy. All world leaders, just about, of liberal democracies have come out and condemned the actions and, as a consequence, condemned Trump. We saw Emmanuel Macron give an incredibly impassioned speech, Boris Johnson, Theresa May, key political figures all coming out in response to this. Biden, I think personally, showed he was very presidential in his address. But again, what more can he say? Of course, that's something that should go without saying, but it almost makes a refreshing change after what we've seen for the past 4 years to have that kind of presidentialism. So I think certainly that double standard is worth outlining, but I agree with you both. What happened in Georgia as well has only kind of led to this.
I also just want to point out like another hypocrisy, I guess, of in the right, I feel like the right wing likes to, paint a picture of the classic left liberal as some snowflake who gets offended at like, all these tiny little things. Like if someone doesn't use your pronoun, for example, then you get offended and like that's the worst thing in the world and all that kind of stuff. But like, when it comes to literally just basic, democracy and things like that, the right has been extremely like reactionary with regards to this election outcome and stuff like that, and it's shown how they can't really handle a loss, for example, in an election, and also going more back to like some right wing like just political figures, I guess, and things like that. I got into a Twitter not argument, but I replied to Tim Pool's Twitter, who's a right wing commentator. I would say he calls himself a disaffected liberal, but everyone knows that's incorrect. And yeah, like all these like right wing commentators are like, wow, like I mean, I can't believe this is happening. This is crazy. And if you look back at all their all the things that they've published recently, it's all these, conspiracy theories about lawsuits going through and, we could potentially overturn the election, clickbaiting people, trying to build the sentiment of, oh my God, like something actually could be happening here, like we could actually overturn the election, and feeding into this narrative of, casting doubt on the election, right? And so it's not like Trump is definitely to blame, but also kind of the media apparatus surrounding U.S. politics, like right U.S. politics, is to blame as well for entertaining these ideas of, potentially overturning the election. And, more than that as well, U.S. senators as well, by kind of objecting to the kind of the process that was like occurring yesterday in terms of like confirmation of President, Biden and Kamala Harris, is also to blame here. Like this, like in the Georgia runoff race, for example, there was a poll done that said it was 41% of Georgians who were basically like polled said that they thought 41% of Georgians thought the presidential election was unfairly conducted, right? And that's a big number of people, and that doesn't just come from Trump. That comes from other political commentators and media pushing this narrative of fraudulent elections, which was not true. It was never true in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as you said, Benj, I think it's true that like it's a bit hypocrisy from like these right wing, new media folks. Like they've been peddling conspiracy theories this whole time, and now they pretend to be shocked about this whole incident. But this I think leads into a good I want to like just give my opinions on like what are the causes, what has led up to this, because I feel like this issue has been like 40-50 years in the making. So I mean, if you don't mind, I just want to go in a bit of a dialogue for a few minutes. It might be a bit lengthy, but yeah, then you can just chime in and give your opinions for it. So yeah, I mean, obviously you can look at USA's history and it's founded, which is based on, genocide and discrimination. But I wanted to look at the more around the historical context between the late 20th century, so from like perhaps the 1970s to our current moment. And I think this can offer an explanation as to why this has happened. And it's all culminated into this big mess, So I first want to start off with, the economic alienation that has been going on for years, I think for around 50 years, since the implementation of the neoliberal economic agenda, especially which was like, forced on by Ronald Reagan. I think this, as I said, it's created it's created economic alienation within America. It has stripped people from meaningful jobs that they feel connected to. Like, you can see all the, Trump talked about the outsourcing of jobs, like, and factories. And I think that plays a big role within the alienation, because that was a stable work that paid well and gave people a good living. And now we're at a scenario, I think, where jobs are increasingly becoming more scarce and there's been more insecure form of work, like as you can see with the rise of the gig economy, or just independent contractors, for example. And this just creates
lack of workers' rights as well.
lack of worker rights, exactly. And yeah, it's become more like just a working environment ripe for anxiety, And I think along with this, I think Republicans and conservatism in general have laid the foundation that Trump has eventually exploited. Like, we see all these Republican senators, like they're all suddenly, like, in the last minute, just like condemning what Trump is doing. But they've been laying this groundwork for years, You can say from the implementation of the drug war to more racist and classist undertones, like the welfare queen, or, lazy people around, like lazy people, thugs. This is just laid. It's more discreet in how they say it, but I think has laid the undertones for discrimination and just hatred in general. And I think Trump has really exploited this foundation that a lot of these Republicans have laid out to. And I think the Democrats and especially the mainstream media have consistently failed, even before Trump, to call these dog whistles out for what they are, and have made out for the Republicans to be good faith actors when they're anything but that. And yeah, and I think this only increased when Obama came to power. And while I'm not the biggest fan of Obama, no doubt that there is a big racial backlash from his presidency, and it's be naive not to think so. I think all these different factors play a big role. And then social media, I think the rise of social media has facilitated the spread of conspiracy theories and just fake news. And as I said, like, all of this, from the job alienation to racial dog whistles and, just undertones to the rise of social media has made this ripe for Trump to come in and just say the quiet part out loud. And this has created a situation where, you can question the validity of the elections, and you can empower fascism. And his failure to condemn fascism and just let it grow. You think about the Charlotte protests a few years ago. People were they were saying Jews will not replace us. And what did he say? He said both sides have bad people. You just see his failure to condemn fascism, and the far right has just allowed it to spread and gain even more power. And yeah, I think the U.S. is just, as I said before, it's the most extreme version of what's a symptom of all Western liberal democracies right now. And yeah, one last thing, I just wanted to go through some statistics that David Sirota, who's a journalist who wrote in Jacobin magazine about the attitudes around the far right in America. So yeah, as you'll see on the screen, some of these statistics. So I'll quote him: "We have long known that the far right, and especially many Trump supporters, are hostile to democracy. Polling data from Monmouth University in 2019 found that 1/3 of the strongest supporters of Trump scored in the highest ratings for authoritarian tendencies. In all, Democracy Fund data show that roughly 1/3 of Americans say that an authoritarian alternative to democracy would be favorable." That's what was on display this Wednesday. While Trump has tried to blame violence on the left, his administration has been trying to downplay the threat of right-wing authoritarianism and white supremacy. In a whistleblower complaint, a former top Homeland Security official alleged that Trump officials ordered him to modify an agency reports section on white supremacy in a manner that made the threat appear less severe. Politico reported earlier this year that Homeland Security officials have waged a year-long internal struggle to get the White House to pay attention to the threat of violent domestic extremism. But they gave up because Trump wasn't interested. Instead, federal security forces were focused on deporting immigrants and investigating environmental activists. The Capitol Police have a $460 million budget and 2,300 personnel to guard the U.S. Capitol complex. For comparison, that is twice the size of the budget of my own city's police department, which is to secure an entire metropolis. Somehow, this army of Capitol security forces were unable or unwilling to stop insurrectionists from breaching the building and taking over the floor of the U.S. Senate. And it's not like they were caught by surprise. They had advance warning of the potential for unrest. So it's almost as if they weren't trying to stop the mayhem. Sorry, this is the last 2 points. Washington Mayor Muriel Bowser request to send a National Guard reinforcements to the Capitol was initially rejected by the Defense Department, the same department whose leadership was recently purged and then replaced with Trump loyalists. That doesn't seem like a coincidence, considering Trump initially refused to call for the insurrectionists to disperse. Lastly, the insurrection clearly fed off months of misinformation by the Republican Party officials who continued to push the lie that the national election was plagued by fraud. Those lies spread. A survey last month found that 3/4 of Republican voters believed the election was fraudulent. Even though nobody has produced evidence of systematic fraud, Republican lawmakers in Washington continue to fuel conspiracy theories, ultimately pressing Congress to overturn the national election. One photo caught Missouri Senator Josh Hawley raising a fist to the oncoming insurrectionists as he headed to the capital city to try halt the certification of the election. So sorry for that long-winded, but especially I think the first 2 points, just the indifference for authoritarianism and feeling sympathy towards that is a real dangerous precedent, So what do you think of my diagnosis of the issues? I mean, I think to say it's just for the last 4 years or the recent elections, I think is misleading and ahistorical.
I think neoliberalism and its implementation, especially in the U.S. and stuff, definitely lays the groundwork for a lot of these issues. As you said, alienation, for example, is one obvious one. And yeah, just in general, I just want to make a point about these protesters, right? Or rioters, I guess you should call them. First of all, I think these people genuinely actually believed that the election was being stolen. I think that was a genuine concern of theirs, because as you kind of discussed, the U.S. Republican reaction to the election, calling it fraudulent, for example. I also, that's just probably the first thing I want to say. And also I want to say that, these people, they genuinely feel, I would assume they genuinely feel economic hurt, from not getting stimulus from the pandemic, for example, from being unemployed for I don't know how many years because of all these jobs being stripped away and stuff like that. And Trump was politically smart to tap into this, resentment, right? This resentment of people who had their lives structured, had it all together, then had it stripped away because of these politicians, which just had the same economic beliefs and didn't have any real revolutionary, not even revolutionary, or just not centrist kind of economic policy ideas and stuff like that, right? And so if you have since the 80s, these people consistently shipping away jobs, having a lack of social apparatus to take care of you, for example, from both the Democratic and Republican side, then you're going to have resentment, and that's just going to bubble up in the surface, and you'll get a figure like Trump, which will tap into that and expose it for what it is. And even though he is just as bad in terms of economic policy as the rest of them, he at least was able to take that populist message and use it to his advantage. And so I think at the root of it, a lot of it is economic discontent, and a lot of these other things coming to the surface are more short-term causes, the Georgia being runoff election. It's not the cause of this, right? It's one of the short-term causes of it. I think a big one is just in general, the economic discontent, as well as the pandemic kind of restricting people's freedoms, as we say, and stuff like that. So yeah, that's what I would say about it.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's certainly symptomatic of a very kind of diseased administration, or certainly administrations over the past decades, really. I think it's true what you were saying about these people do feel incredibly economically, socially, politically disadvantaged. there is something to be said for 2016 and Trump kind of succeeding on this anti-establishment, drain the swamp narrative. Rightly or wrongly, it clearly connected with a lot of voters that hadn't been voters for the past few decades because they were so disillusioned. So it's kind of no surprise that people are feeling passionately that they don't want to go back to this kind of status quo of politics, this establishment, which is really encapsulated by Biden. But then the acts that they've taken to prevent this are, well, inexcusable. I think it's interesting, Samuel, what you were saying with social media as well, and how that's kind of a big symptom of how things have progressed and been able to kind of really fester over the past few years. Trump has had his Twitter account deactivated for 12 hours and it will only be reconnected, I read, on the premise that he deletes some of his, I think it's 3 tweets, which Twitter's like community guidelines see as really kind of inciting violence and going against democracy and things. So for the President of the United States to be in this position, it's absolutely unbelievable. But then also it's more unbelievable that he may not take those tweets down. He's standing by what he's saying about the election having been robbed from us. When he released that message last night saying, like, we support you but go home now, that didn't come before a whole diatribe of how it was still rigged and it was still fixed and that we'd been cheated by the system. He could have at least just left that till the end, but it still foreshadows anything that he should kind of say or is being made to say by senior aides of more of the message of peace so they don't completely damage US democracy. I think a lot of senior Republicans as well, it goes without saying, are now just incredibly worried about the reputation of the party, and I'm sure the future of the Republican Party is something we'll probably come back to time and time again now. There's a decisive split down the middle and a huge power vacuum that will be left by Trump, and it will be interesting to see how this is filled and how they kind of try to act together against some of Biden's policies and things like that. Finally, also, Mike Pence, I think, is worthy of mention in terms of he himself has been no less guilty of riling up this sentiment of an election that was robbed from us and this undemocratic nature of what happened so that the establishment can remove Trump. So I don't have that much sympathy for people saying that, oh, well, he came out and did the right thing last night, because it was so late. He really did jump the ship just as it sunk. I think it makes little to no difference, and him and Trump will retain some kind of relationship. But even these really senior Republicans that are coming out and condemning this behaviour, it's not noteworthy, nor should it be. It should be their kind of fundamental democratic duty to do so. Also, just kind of bringing it back to the UK really quickly, I've seen a lot of right-wing commentators also drawing parallels between the events that we saw last night and a lot of the anti-Brexit protests and marches that we've seen in London over the past few years, and cities around the UK for that matter. I think it's important to highlight how no anti-Brexit protest or march were people in armed suits with bulletproof vests, with guns, with machetes, in battle clothing, nor were they planned for months and months beforehand as some kind of civil war, as the Facebook groups that have been planning this march have been seen to do. So I think that's just one thing that needed drawing attention to. There's a difference between a kind of democratic vote that someone disagrees with that then being protested, whether rightly or wrongly, and the events that we saw last night.
Yeah, I also just real quick want to comment on, you guys are both right in speaking about these social media monopolies, right? Being a big part in this behavior. And I would just also say, again, linking it back to the economic side, having a lack of regulation on these kind of big tech companies is what it allows them to, wield so much power, right? And so you see Trump have all this rhetoric surrounding breaking up big tech, right? but yeah, like it hasn't happened at the end of the day. But I'm just saying, like, again, it links to that same point of like the economy and how it functions. So yeah, I just thought it was worth pointing that out. And to build, I'll go to you in a second, Sab, but just to build on this point of the Republicans and their lack of response, or like them jumping ship at the last moment. It's just really like and kind of the future of the Republican Party, right? Because the Republican Party right now is in a mess, right? It's split in terms of Trump loyalists and people who were Trump loyalists but realize, look, I'm going to have no political future in Washington once we get past this episode, and therefore I need to kind of abandon what I've just created, right? And Mike Pence obviously is in one of the worst of both worlds, right? He's enabled Trump throughout this whole process, but he also is someone who's interested in running in 2024 as a presidential candidate. But he's in this attempt of him trying to like put this image of him being democratic and I respect principles and all this kind of stuff is literally his play to try redeem himself so he's eligible to run in 2024. Because if it was politically smart for him to support Trump throughout this process, and with regards to like election, in the next election, getting elected in the next election, then he would have gone with Trump this whole way. Like Mike Pence only cares about potentially becoming president, and it's only because it's not beneficial to him that he actually came out against this. I'm 100% sure of this. This guy has supported Trump when it's benefited him the most, and now that it doesn't benefit him, he's jumping ship, and it's spineless and just disgusting, like actually disgusting to have this happen in the US. And just I don't know, just really infuriating.
Yeah, I mean, as you just mentioned, I mean, I have no sympathy whatsoever for any Republican. They just not only have they been opportunists now, just jumping ship with Trump, but as I said before, they've been riling up the base, and they've been laying the foundation for Trump to exploit. They've been playing on people's misery, using they blame people's misery on xenophobic tendencies, or on immigrants, on people of color. Like they've been riling up the base, and they just allowed Trump to exploit this. And as I said, I'm just tired of the Democrats and the media just like not seeing them for what they are. Just because they're saying stuff in a polite manner doesn't mean they're not saying the same thing as Trump. So I think people have to start understanding the threat that a lot of Republicans, they bring, and they're not so much different to Trump, So I just think, it does make me angry. This complete disregard for the the rhetoric around what Republicans say. So yeah, I think it's frustrating. And going back to what you said about the social media, like you're right. I think you are right in what you're saying about the tech. But I also say I think the 2008 financial crash and the rise of social media kind of happened at the exact same time. And I think, as I mentioned and you guys mentioned before, it kind of helped create the perfect storm for for spreading fake news and false information. And I mean, I don't want to be overemphasize technology, because these far right tendencies have risen historically without the internet, But it definitely does make the process easier, So I just think it's just a mess. And lastly, I think going back to what Rachel said about talking about these protesters, how they kind of don't want the status quo to come back, in Joe Biden. I do think, I mean, I can see that line in 2016 when he got first elected, because he's the unknown. But after 4 years of him in power, I just don't know how they can consider him still being a status quo member, I mean, still being outside of the status quo. Sorry, because he's done nothing that's so different to Republicans. He's supported tax cuts. He hasn't stopped any wars. He
had the biggest tax cuts in years. He
Exactly.
had the biggest. I mean, it's unbelievable.
He's increased drone strikes when he said he was going to stop the war. He hasn't stopped outsourcing of jobs. He's been the same as every other status quo politician for the last 4 years. So I think it's just, at this point, I think it's just it's like a brainwashing to think that he's done anything so different, you know? It's either that or him being so brash about his thoughts on immigration, on, you know, different social movements have allowed people to gain some form of connection to him for their hatred with this stuff as well. I mean, because he hasn't done anything like significant legislatively, you know, to be considered as someone that's an outsider, because he's not anymore, you know. And yeah, we have to try like break this myth that he is, because it's not true.
Yeah, I agree. I think in terms of what you were saying about brainwashing as well, I was listening to America Cast with kind of Laura Kuenssberg, John Sopel, among other commentators. And they were remarking on how he has created this kind of cult of personality post-truth era where he's dictating his own facts and his followers are believing them. And this kind of narrative that he's constructed entirely himself and based facts entirely on his own opinions, kind of denied very, very obvious stats and facts and labelled it as fake news. It's certainly symptomatic, again, of the kind of media outlets and things which people were so disillusioned with, and he's certainly picked up on that niche. But I don't see a time when the supporters and the people that stormed Capitol building last night will turn around and say, yes, actually, you know, I understand the election was lost and Trump this was just because of Trump's failings as a president. People voted for Biden instead, because it's so toxic, but also so effective, this kind of post-truth era that he's really been able to capitalize on. And I think he certainly won't be the last populist leader to do so, but it doesn't bode well for even just kind of media and journalism. But having said that, on a slightly lighter note, as much as some of his supporters are getting all of their news coverage of the events that are going on purely through his Twitter feed and other kind of right-wing commentators, CNN, the New York Times, and a lot of other kind of multinational corporations and American newspapers and media outlets have actually seen their subscriptions increase. So while there is a separation between those who are kind of very committed to this post-truth fake news era, on the other side there are certainly people still looking for facts and kind of wanting more of an independent, if it's another argument whether those institutions are completely independent, but more of an unbiased, factual at the very least kind of viewpoint, which is good. Certainly any kind of like increase in readership is a positive.
I will also say, yeah, I mean, that's definitely is a positive. And again, subscribe for independent media. But no, yeah, like there is like also something which is quite funny with this whole, you know, Trump supporter, and as you said, kind of post-truth like narratives, all that kind of stuff. It's like at least on the YouTube space, I would say, you know, you have all these right-wingers being like, man, these postmodern leftists, all that kind of stuff, like putting all these buzzwords together. But if you look at like actually what's happening, man, it feels like the like Trump supporters are the actual like, you know, genuine postmodernists in this whole fiasco, man. They're living in their like literal own reality. And yeah, it's really just unreal. But I will say, I think we should, I mean, if it's okay with you guys, look at kind of going forward now. What can the Biden presidency do to counteract this tendency of, you know, just like you know, just not living in reality, right? Like how can he, you know, tap into this area of disillusioned voters and use it to his advantage? And you know, as we've said already, you know, the Georgia Senate races are key in at least having like an apparatus for him to do that. Whether he will or will not, it's a different story. But at least from my perspective, Joe Biden, I think, to really, you know, try kind of root this out and like get things a bit more to normality, and just get more support from people in the U.S. more generally, is to really have a bold economic plan to come out of coronavirus. Well, first of all, handle coronavirus. I mean, that's the first thing, right? He has to handle coronavirus and contain it, and as long as I'll take, get the U.S. out of that mess, and then he can focus on rebuilding America's economy. And I think in doing so, he has to have a really bold plan in terms of job creation, and also just caring about different issues like climate change, like healthcare, and offering legislation which is supported by people in America, like Medicare for All, supported by over 70% of the U.S. The Green New Deal as well, also a really popular line of legislation amongst people in the U.S. So I think it's what he has to focus on to try to give people some, literally, like, just some material benefit of voting him in, right? It doesn't matter if Trump's a president, and Biden's a president, if you can't afford food at the end of the month, right? So that's what you need to try. In my view, that's what he has to try do to try, really get things to normalcy. And yeah, what are you guys' thoughts?
Yeah, yeah. As you said, I think the big thing for Biden's part is definitely to try push legislation that appeals to the people's material needs, and the real things like you said, healthcare, for example, or secure jobs, job security, etc. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think there are ones that are too far gone. Like, no matter how many people, no matter how much legislation you push to improve lives, there'll be still be people that won't be convinced, and they'll still be attached to Trump and his personality and his wild beliefs, But I definitely think you can appeal to a large amount of people if you actually materially change their lives, So yeah, I mean, I know in the 1920s, when the Great Depression, there was quite a big appeal towards fascism, and there was quite a big, although minority, there was a risk of being fascism being a problem within American society. But the the New Deal, it kind of helped put a lot of this stuff to bed, because it ultimately improve people's lives, in many different ways. So it kind of helped address these extremist thoughts. So I definitely think Joe Biden can do stuff like that. But also, I mean, I also wanted to look at besides Biden, what are they going to do now about this whole fiasco yesterday with the insurgency and the attempt, as you said, a diet coup? Like, what can we do to address that? Because I think we see now, like, as soon as they restarted the confirmation, there was a consolidation between Republicans and Democrats, both calling out these protests as what they are, But I think, it's obviously good that they united on this issue that trying to do a coup is a bad thing. I think Democrats, they really have to learn the lesson and be more skeptical and critical towards Republicans and their motives, Because if we keep letting them get away with this, and as I said, thinking they're good faith actors, you're gonna come up with a situation again, So you need to obviously, it's good to be unified in this moment, but they need to be critical and make sure that they don't let people get away with this, And also, I know Congressman Cory Bush has already said she'll be introducing a resolution calling for the Republican members of Congress who kind of invoked this riot and kind of promoted it to be expelled. So I think that's a reasonable call, because call for violence and an anti-democratic demonstration is dangerous, and I think she's right to bring that resolution, and I think it's a good step. But I think also, there's also been like rumors about invoking the 25th Amendment, which essentially allows the vice president, together with the majority of either the principal officers of the executive departments or the bodies of Congress, to declare the president unable to discharge the powers and duties of their office in a written declaration. So this can kind of provide a path to to kick out Donald Trump. I don't know if that's necessary right now, but that's also there's also reports about that being considered within the Congress. And then also going into the bigger picture, I think it's also a good time to think about certain things like the electoral college and rethinking about democracy in the country in general, because I mean, I think many people agree that that whole system is kind of flawed. So I think it's also an opportunity to step back and rethink that. But I think that's a much bigger picture. But I think Cory Bush is offering a good solution right now to at least hold these Congress people accountable for their incitement. And alongside that, I think from the left's perspective, I think there needs to be more grassroots and community organizing to make people conscious about their current economic structures and the effect that it's having on their lives, so they don't have to turn to more xenophobic and racist excuses to why things are like the way they are. And also just building unions for people in order to like combat use solidarity to combat more nationalistic and fascistic answers to the problems we face. So I think these are some aspects that Biden can take, and also in general as a society. So yeah, hopefully the Democrats will be more bold in this situation. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I don't have too much to add myself. I think Biden certainly needs to focus on, as you were saying, kind of provide people that voted for him just with some kind of palpable material benefits for doing so. Especially with COVID, he's obviously got a huge amount on his plate there, with the death toll, the kind of beginning of vaccinations, lockdowns, and the economic damage that we'll see for generations through that. So that has to be his primary priority. Under Obama as well, he was kind of very, very international in his outlook. That needs to be reined in, and it is a domestic policy approach which has to take precedence. Again, just relating back to COVID, and also just the kind of social discontent that we've seen in America, encapsulated by last night's events, but the summer protests of Black Lives Matter, and again, this just being a symptom of kind of years and years of a very diseased system and a very, very separated and disjointed one. So I think they should be his top priorities, that kind of domestic agenda, and I'm sure that they will be, along with Harris and other senators. But yeah, I don't personally have too much to add there. I think just hopefully looking to the future with Biden, and I mean the one thing is it can't be worse per se than that of the past 4 years. So that can be a little like hope in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think it can be. Oh, sorry. Go.
No, I'm saying, yeah, I don't think it'll be worse, but I am worried that if not sufficient action is taken, that someone that's worse than Trump might pop up in the next election or in a few years. So yeah, I mean, I don't think it'll get worse, but yeah, hopefully action will be taken to kind of like, weaken this element of America. This part of America. So yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, I also want to say I don't think that again, like more in that looking forward kind of section now. I don't think that Trump will get prosecuted or go to jail for any of the things which he's done during his presidency or even before with regards to tax dodging or whatever it may be, just simply because presidents in general don't really, that doesn't really happen, right? So, I mean, Obama wasn't prosecuted for anything, even though he definitely has done illegal things in the past, and neither is, I mean, it just doesn't really happen. So, for anyone who thinks that that's maybe a possibility, I would definitely urge you to maybe look a little bit more in terms of like the history of some of these presidencies and what's happened, after they've ended their terms. So yeah, that's one kind of side note. And another point which I want to kind of discuss is this idea of Trump running in 2024. What do you guys think about that? Do you think it's a viable kind of thing to happen, or do you think after 2024 he's done? Because at least from my view, it's like he loves the attention, he loves the rallies, he loves all these things, right? And it's like what basically like gets him going, right? Like he loves it. So I could see him like, that happening, like him hosting rallies and stuff like that throughout the next 4 years in order to try build up, enough base support to again run in 2024 and become, win the election?
I mean, personally, I'd say I'm a bit more skeptical. I think that if there's one thing he values above anything else, it's his ego. And his ego definitely has to have been damaged by the electoral defeat and by close aides, senior Republicans kind of turning their back on him at this moment where he probably feels like he needs it the most. I think also just from kind of reading White House staffers and things, he's exhausted, as anyone would be after a kind of 4-year term. Whether you can say he's actually done as much as most presidents have in terms of the day-to-day running of things and the job on paper is another thing. But I agree, he certainly loves the attention and the rallies and everything, but I'm not sure if he will. Personally, I'm more skeptical. I think he may be a kind of high-profile donor and introduce candidates and things and have rallies on their behalf, but I'm not too sure if the real nitty-gritty will be for him in another 4 years' time.
Yeah.
I just want to add quick. I think he might launch a news network. I could definitely see that happening.
Yeah, there's some reports about that, right? But yeah, I mean, I'm also in two minds about this because, as you said, Benj, it's like he does love the limelight and the attention and the admiration, and also, I mean, one could say maybe he's like, his insistence on election fraud. Maybe we could say it's either like him being a big baby and not accepting reality, or it could be some way to keep his base riled up. So when he runs for the next election, but I think it depends on how people perceive him in the next few years. I think if there's energy still there within his base and he's still admired by a decent amount of people within America, maybe he will consider it in 2024. But yeah, I mean, and as Rachel said, I think he is exhausted, and I think ultimately maybe he wants to stick to doing business, and as you said, maybe making a news network. So yeah, I'm not entirely sure what will happen, I mean, I hope he doesn't, but maybe he's lining someone up within his family or someone close to him to take over in 2024. So we'll see. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we will definitely see about that. Yeah, so do you guys have anything else to add, really? Or not much?
No, not much to add. At least Biden now is confirmed. So that's good. Despite all the protests, he's confirmed. But yeah, just a dark day yesterday in America, and hopefully people start to think about the root causes of these issues, and try to address it.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, thank you guys all for listening, and I'm sure we'll be back on the weekend to go a little bit more in depth into different news stories as we were planning on doing today. But yeah, I had to cover it. So anyway, guys, thank you for watching, and thank you, Samuel, Rachel, for being great co-hosts today. And we'll see you guys all very soon.
Thank you.